That's a great question, and probably we should pray for all of those leaders, church leaders and government leaders. I suspect in the circumstances we as Americans find ourselves in these days, it may well be more on her mind to be thinking of civil leaders and political leaders. And, you know, I just recently completed for Ligonier a series, a study on Romans, and I had to do some thinking about Romans 13 for that. And it really came home to me again how very strong Paul is in talking about civic leaders as servants of God, as ministers of God, that I think Paul, like Peter in 1 Peter 2, is influenced by his observation that some Christians in their first century context had begun to say, since I'm free in Christ, I really don't have to pay much attention to these civic leaders. I'm free in Christ and therefore transcend obligations to these unbelieving civic authorities. And both Paul and Peter are making very strong arguments that that is fundamentally wrong, that our freedom in Christ does not dissolve our obligations of obedience to the civil authorities God has placed over us. And so our prayers for those civil authorities ought to be serious and sincere and earnest. They ought to be prayers that the civil authorities would fulfill the responsibilities that God has given them. And that responsibility is to do justice, to promote real justice in the world, not to serve themselves or their own interests or the interests of any claque of people that supports them. It's interesting that in the scriptures, we're going to talk about this a little bit at the conference tomorrow. In the scriptures, the focus is in the Psalms, a particular obligation of rulers to protect the poor and the weak. And so we ought to be praying that civic leaders will fulfill that. And where we feel that civic leaders may not be Christians in the way they're fulfilling their office, we should pray for their conversion. So all of those are areas in which we ought to be earnestly in prayer, and would be one of the ways in which we honor our civic leaders by taking their needs before the Lord. In terms of church leaders, we ought to be praying for pastors and elders and deacons that they will be faithful to the scriptures and faithful to their calling to lead the people of God in the churches.
That answer was recorded live during a special Ask Ligonier event. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on our next live event.